Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to say a few things about this book, and then I'm going to pass the microphone over to the authors. We've got two of the editors, authors here today. They were both editors and authors. This is really an extraordinary book. It's such a rich volume, and I'm going to just describe what's in it a little bit, just to give you an idea of what kind of book it is. And I want to just draw out some of the themes that I could see emerging looking at the book and reading the book. So it's called Terrazza. It's called Artists, Histories, Places in Italy in the 2000s. It's edited by 4 different editors. And it's divided into 3 parts. There's a part which is a discussion between the editors about what they're actually doing. And there is quite a very interesting sort of dialectical debate there about what this book is, what they'd like to do, what kind, and what it isn't. And so it's very much an open, the book is a book that opens out. It's not a closed narrative, it's not trying to impose any themes on the artist it's chosen. It's very, very creative also in the way it's been produced. So it's not just the content, but also the form of the book that I think is very interesting. There's that part where the four editors, curators, whatever we want to call them, authors, talk about what the actual volume is. And they talk about theory, they talk about practice, they talk about institutional problems. One of the problems that they bring up is that of these very expensive museums that have been created in Italy, for example, the Maxi in Rome, which then don't have any money to put on anything. So there's this problem, which I'll come back to, of the institutions, the big institutions, and what this book is kind of showing is that there's a whole galaxy of alternative, short-term, many of which I've never heard of. Institutions, probably the wrong word, but kind of things that emerge and put on art and give space to art, or train artists, or allow artists to show their work and create work, which are outside of, but sometimes linked to the big institutions. So it's a whole world which is there, which is extremely creative and interesting, and in fact hopeful. You know, in a moment where all we ever hear about is crisis, this book is kind of shows you that it's in the art world, at least, in this kind of art world, the crisis has been in some way bypassed by a whole load of different kinds of institutions being created. So the first part is this discussion. The second part is this mapping that the authors do with an extraordinary deep research of these alternative institutions, these foundations, these places where art has been produced, contemporary art has been created, allowed spaces, shows, courses, all kinds of things. And that's this very detailed mapping, but not boring, very interesting, the reading of it, kind of the discussion of it, mapping of all these very many, from north to south of Italy, right across Italy, not necessarily in the main cities, also in the provinces, of places where contemporary artists flourished, has been given spaces in the 2000s, which is the area, the period chosen by. So there's a mapping, a very detailed mapping, which is a bit like a quadriennale, virtuale in some ways of this. And I found that absolutely fascinating. I didn't know many of these places I've never heard of, and I think it's extremely useful also as a document that you could come back to at various other times. And then the big part of the book, if you like, the whole second part of the volume is taken up with a number of artists whose work is discussed. There are photographs of their work, there's a discussion of who they are, where they come from, and descriptions of some of their key works. And again, here this is extremely rich and fascinating. And these are all very young artists working in all kinds of different media, all kinds of different ways. And I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I saw as an historian emerging in the work itself from the 2000s, and some of the ways I thought that Italy was being reflected in this work. One of the things that I saw was a question of spaces. Italy was an industrial country in the 50s and 60s, or large parts of Italy were industrial. They had an industrial revolution in the post-war period. And what this art in the 2000s, much of it is interested in investigating the post-industrial spaces, the old factories. In fact, Andrea worked at a very successful gallery which is housed in an old factory in Sesto San Giovanni, the kind of capital of the working class in Milan, which no longer has a working class. So there's lots of work here which is either looking at that post-industrial phase, or using the spaces of factories, places of production, electrical places, all kinds of strange things that were produced, or unfinished buildings, all these kind of very creative way. So it's these new spaces that opened up in the cities and elsewhere by a completely different kind of form of production, post-industrial Italy. And I found that really interesting. There's a trace there that was going through the whole book. The second trace I saw was one about politics and memory. It's often said that this generation of artists and of young people in general is a post-political generation. There's something called the riflusso. They're not interested in politics. This is not true in this book at all. There's a very strong theme of interest in memory, in history, in looking at the past, in revisiting events of the past, like in Caso Moro, for example, and other events, in rethinking those events, and in thinking about memory of the Second World War. There's lots of different works which do that in a very creative way, and I saw that very political work often, and I thought that was very interesting. I wasn't expecting that necessarily from the book. This is a book which in theory is about Italian art, but in practice reflects the fact that this is a globalized world, that there's an Italian diaspora. Many of the artists don't live in Italy, don't work in Italy. They're almost all Italian, but Italy is a reference point, and that sort of raises the question, what is Italian art? What is Italian identity? And I think that is a very interesting question that emerges. This is a kind of global book, and it shows how the connections also in the fact that Andrea and Luca don't even work in Italy, and there's a whole opening out of the narratives about where art is produced, how it's produced, which I think this book does in a very interesting way, and it shows you, and that has been increasingly a question also linked up to the crisis of this Italian diaspora, of these talented Italians not working in Italy. And here we can see how this is linking up in various networks. And the final theme I saw emerging, and there were lots of other themes, was one of a new Italy, which is a multicultural Italy, an Italy with 5 million immigrants in it. And this theme comes out of a lot of the work in the book. Looking at what that means about migration, about the costs of migration, but also the benefits of migration. That's definitely something that emerges in a lot of the work. So it's not just the diaspora of Italians, it's also the arrival of Italy being a completely different society to the Italy of the 1980s, with the foreign migration of this level in the last 20 years, which is probably the key social, cultural fact, if you like, of Italy in the last 20 years, and that emerges very clearly in many of the works. So these kind of themes, and there are lots of others, I think this is a very modern book, a very interesting book, a very important book, and I'd like to, those are the key points I want to make in the introduction. I want to pass the word to the authors that we have here with us to talk further about the work.
So thanks, John, for your introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. So first of all, I need to admit, maybe it's our common feeling, that was not an easy task, such a commission, because of course trying to think and to reflect to such an extended time, historical time, 15 years, where really a lot of things happen, and it's very, as you can imagine, it's not easy to represent something that is moving constantly, is moving and changing. So basically, when you do such a book, it's already old when it's released, and but it was a challenge, but also a very interesting research and occasion to us also to reflect and to looking back and trying to suggest possible ways, and we always choose to use the plural also in the title, artists, histories, stories, just because of course on one end it's really impossible to narrate just a single, unique story or history of art and works or of art, and so what we try to at least to propose are different trajectories. So we try in the way in the attitude we did with this volume, not to just focus only on the artist and just doing a kind of index of the best of Italian art, but just to make it everything a bit more complex. I don't know if we were able to succeed in that, but at least that was the approach. And especially the first part, there was a big research and trying to really think about what could think about all the situations, places, exhibition, festival that were in a way generative of something, and that were important also on our, in a way, education. Also, I mean, I can see myself growing up surrounded by a lot of these things. It was like a common playground in a way, and so just to represent this multifaceted scenario of Italy, as you can see, now, and while in the second part trying to select a number of artists that are here not only because we consider maybe the best artists, but because we thought they were the best. I mean, they fit within this context to represent in a very open way. I mean, where the figures, the players of what you see in this second part, and so also including some artists that are not proper visual artists, so really playing that are a bit in between, and so this kind of in between languages, in between spaces, in between figures was also kind of very conscious in a way statement. So you see, I don't know, Martino Gamper, she's a designer / artist that is recently also to exhibit as in a way an artist, but a kind of always, or Michelangelo Frammartino that is more like a filmmaker, or younger people like Lorenzo Seni that is really coming also from not the art background. And also this is also interesting that maybe after we had this kind of yellow brick on our ends, we noticed also certain questions and thoughts that were maybe before were not totally sharp and clear even to us. And so it's not so much an answer we didn't want to say, okay, this is, but trying really to suggest a kind of open ways, and I'm very happy that could be perceived a book not only about art, but with, let's say, a wider view on what happened in Italy, and of course now it's not only Italy, but because all of us, we are part of a larger community. And yeah, I don't know. Andrea.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to recall while watching the PowerPoint of the book the amount of work we did, and it's almost impossible to add something else, but we might be saying the reason why we decided to focus on the first part and how we kind of invented a way to collaborate. And it's always challenging to work with someone else and to find a way to share ideas and find a way to map a situation. So first thing, the first part, which is actually a huge amount of places, festival, books, exhibition, will be probably in the future considered the ideal source of the artists that will be presented in the second part. So, and speaking about source, I will probably clarify and say what is a true source today for an artist. A source is not only necessarily the history of art, might be a festival, might be a relevant exhibition, might be an unknown underground space, might be a concert, might be a professor. So that's the reason why when you just try to find a fil rouge, a connection between all those different situations, we might maybe only seeing people and different people, often young people, and not necessarily artworks or masterpieces. And you will see images of a concert, you will see images of someone playing, you will see a reproduction of magazines, so as that's the case at Scura. So that would be probably kind of providing another layer, and that was for us very, very, very important. So how to, yes, kind of define the sources for that different generation, new generation. And if I would, while trying to get back to the sources, obviously there were very interesting facts that happened in Italy in the last 15 years, and probably one that we should mention is the growth of this big wave of free and independent magazines that really changed a way to share art in Italy. So one of the reasons why Italian artists are, not only in Italy right now, why Italian art is not only in Italy, is that thanks to people as Luca with his work with the collective Nero, and with people that, as the guy that ran Cura or Mus or Kaleidoscope, we kind of changed the perception of what Italy is and how make this cross-pollination between this very strange country, which with a solid, incredible heritage, and what's happening right now in the world. So one of the central points was actually underlining the fact that the production, the invention, the maintenance for more than 5 years of independent, often free magazine was so important for different places. Another completely different issue, and that was a task we had, was actually find a way to respect the fact that art doesn't happen only in Milan and in Torino, as it was in the past in Genova, where Arte Povera was born, but happens also in the south. So I guess one of the main challenges we got when conceiving this book was actually finally covering a huge amount of places, events, and artists that will come from the south part of Italy. And as actually, I guess, we kind of respect the fact that in the previous generation, the balance between male and female wasn't so interesting as it is right now. So I guess those are the let's say the fundaments of this book. the point of view of the artist, I'm trying to go a little bit faster. What's that? How did we work, actually? We decided to dedicate to any artist 4 pages. And those 4 pages will be working somehow, I guess we agree on that, as a solo show. So the idea of a group show that doesn't exist, that it didn't happen, it's somehow true. But instead of being a group show, those are 60 different solo shows. And I think one of the challenges and one of the tasks and one of the achievements we got is that the texts are not just the introduction, are probably very good, I hope so, very good reviews or very good solo shows, because we tried also to tune on languages and kind of trying also to share the idea of showing some peculiar work. So instead of writing critic text, we probably wrote more curatorial text, introducing to the imagery of an artist, introducing to the practice of an artist, introducing to the way he would deal with materials and technique. And yes, so there are probably many more layers, but the last one will be probably the discussion, which is the introduction of the book. I guess in the very beginning our intention was to have it as a conclusion, and now it became an introduction. And this discussion was actually what we discussed in Rome in our meeting. It's a very open discussion. We didn't need it so much, so that's the reason why we probably forgot something. That's the reason why we probably were sometimes very rude. We had recently a very interesting exchange with Luca Terrazza, who was one of our benchmarks, because he was a very important figure in the early 2000s in Italy as curator and as a critic, and he did contribute to a book that was seminal for us called Espresso, which is a true precedent for this book. And the email exchange we had with him was very curious, because he was probably looking for or trying to understand why we didn't quote his work in a certain way, and the reason why we would probably consider him as a precedent, but not kind of mapping entirely what he did. So we actually printed what we did before, and it might be a little bit rude, might be a little bit direct, might be a little bit without mediation, but it's what did happen. So one mistake we did for the book, I'm telling everything actually, is that we completely forgot, for some weird reason, to put the sources in the end in bibliography. So there is any reference to any book or to any event that happened before us. That's on the point of view of an historian of art, which is supposedly where I'm coming from in my job description somehow, is an enormous mistake. But it's probably the unconscious mistake that we did on purpose, because we thought probably the sources have changed so much that it's much more interesting for us to conceive those 100 places, festivals, situation, events, figure, professor, as more important as a book. So we are probably proud to forget sometimes, while considering some crucial figures. And among those crucial figures, we should say we kind of pay a lot of respect to some artists that teach informally or formally, as Cesare Pietroiussi in Rome, and he is, yes, one of the key figures behind this book, ideally, as a kind of inspirating figure. So I guess we obviously could speak for more than 1 year and a half, because it's the time we spent in working on this book, and it's sad you cannot have it in your hand, but I'm trying to, yes, to advance a little bit.
I wanted to ask, so that it's a very democratic book, because all the artists, and I think it's much lighter without the bibliography. I mean, I like the fact that it wasn't the bibliography that would have made it much heavier, as not physically heavier, but heavier as a text. But you know, the artists that are in alphabetical order, there's no hierarchy of who's good, who's what I wanted to know is, how did you choose these artists? Why did you choose these artists and not others? And did you, I mean, so that's the question. How did this choice come about? Because you must have excluded so many as well. So,
in a way, as I mentioned before, we try to choose. Of course, we have for people with also different backgrounds, tastes, and interests. And so, first of all, was an interesting also dialogue among us, but I think that each of us, we are pretty happy of what is the result. But most of all, we were not just each one proposing our names or 10 names or whatever, but really trying to choose the artists for different reasons. So, of course, we insist on a certain generation. So, maybe we were discussing before, Diego Perrone and Flavio Favelli maybe are the oldest one, and but then we try to give a much kind of open view and spectrum of what happened, really in relation also to the mappatura of the second part. And so you have, I don't know, Nico Vascellari, Lorenzo Senni, that in a way are really coming out from this kind of more let's say, even if I hate as a word, underground kind of scene, or mostly related to music, or other a certain number of artists that were really kind of dealing also with certain political, social issues, or going back to also the history of Italy, or certain kind of key historical episodes, as you in a way mentioned before, that could be Rossella Biscotti, Patrizia Di Massimo, Francesca Rena. So we're really trying to open as much as possible. And but then another element that I think can be pretty visible is also that the generation, this new generation, is really a generation that didn't want to wait like something coming from above, but really to react and to obtain something, to get something, also in a cultural scenario where, of course, artists, they don't get a kind of real institutional support. We don't have to forget that Italy, compared to, I don't know, the institutional models that you can have in France or in Germany, you don't have any kind of small or mid institution or artist exhibition spaces that really, where you can experiment, where you can also fail sometimes before getting to the next step. And that's, I think, is a very positive aspect, and that's why like in the first part you can really witness such kind of vivid kind of activity of artists, really open spaces, producing exhibition by themselves. And this is a let's say that I think it's a much more pragmatic generation compared to the one of the 90s, where in a way it seems that the 90s there was a lot of open discussion about what we can do, what it could be, and this is like the continuation of that discussion, but bringing it to reality and making it is a very like we would like to see I don't know, an exhibition of a certain artist. We don't wait to a museum or a space to show it, but we bring it. And also, of course, the technology development helped a lot. Also, instant kind of communication and information, constant flux of information and exchange among artists. So everything is happening at the same time. That could be a good or negative aspect. And so also another element that you can see and is pretty peculiar of Italy is also this big explosion, the boom of these private foundations that, of course, for I don't know, for an American is pretty strange that like private, they don't support museums, but they decide instead to open their own spaces. And but this is again as artists decided to fund like to develop artist spaces or to organize exhibitions by themselves, as well privates in a way they decide to offer a more dynamic kind of model to these kind of almost sometimes dead institutions or dinosaurs. And so in a way you can see a kind of alternative models of institutions, if we can call it like that. And so it's really a movement coming from the bottom and not the opposite. So it's of course the Italian artistic scene is not like didn't grow up through a kind of really institutional support. As a young artist, you don't have, after you're coming out of the academy, you usually have an exhibition at private galleries, but then there is not something so much happening. And also in the last, from the 2000 there was, we witnessed the opening of many museums, and this is something that there were like great expectations about that. And now after already 10 years, we can see the results that are not so positive as I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's happening with like major museums like Macro in Rome, also Rivoli in Torino. So sadly, many institutions really suffer also of how I mean, on a political level, the policy is not always so great. So I don't know, you can be appointed in a museum, and then after a year and a half, according to like political change, everything you are fired, and so it's very hard to set up and to give an identity to an institution. Then, especially for museums, that is very important. Is like is a very long-term work, and so you need time. You need time to put like to start to work slowly and to set up something, and that's in Italy is very hard. And yeah, so in a way, out of this negative kind of situation, grew up, you can see a very positive aspect. So that's why maybe the cover is yellow.
Maybe on the practical point of view, what we did was actually just sharing a list of names and getting back to the question. So about choosing the process of choosing the artist. So obviously we didn't agree about the number somehow. I mean, we should say high, but it's probably better to have a broader way than another one. I don't remember clearly that I was fighting for getting 44, just because of the well-known song about the 44 cats. Since Terrazza is already a reference to many things. On the one hand, it might be a terrace or a place where you will watch what's below and what's there from above, and it might be too hierarchical, and how to break this idea of being up and watching a panorama, a landscape. So that's the first misunderstanding that we need to kind of deal with. But on the other hand, it's an important reference to a great magazine that was a groundbreaking magazine in Milan, and not only bridging different disciplines run by Andrea Lissoni and his wife. And the third reference might be a very weird word that doesn't exist actually in Italian, terrazza, which means it is not the terrace, but is also a way to speak about earth, actually, no? And it's a kind of way to see it's not a beautiful, it's not a beautiful earth actually, but it's not easy to translate. So the process of selection was interesting and challenging. Obviously, the problem is always how many artists will be considering who is not part of the selection, who will be part of the selection. And I think in the end we did agree, and we agreed also on the fact that we will not show, speak, or write about 3-4 works for every artist, finding a way to kind of making clear the reason why we're choosing this artist. And yes, that's almost everything. We are probably very proud, because we did represent any possible media, we did represent any possible area, and obviously there is someone that's not part of the book, there is someone that will not probably be part of the book, or if we'll be doing it in 2 years' time, or right now. But in principle, we are very happy, I would say, with what we have done. So, yes, that's it.
In fact, in the just to come back on one of the points that was made just now, in the discussion, there's one of the editors says this: the public sector has given up a central catalyst role, leaving plenty of room for the birth of other private or independent initiatives, from magazines to foundations. So there's this kind of alternative world that's opened up, and here it's documented. I would also say that there's a kind of a very interesting tendency here, which is also kind of small is beautiful, and we're coming up to the Expo in Milan, which is a mega event, I suppose, and perhaps the message here is that that isn't necessarily the best way in a modern world to let this kind of creativity flourish, but that's just a point I've made on top of that. I think we've got some time for questions, contributions from the audience, or anyone else wants to come back. So I'll hand, I don't know what's going to happen with the microphone, but if anyone wants to ask anything, you can pass it back. Yeah.
I think I can speak now.
Okay, fine.
So I wanted to ask the authors what would be their hopes for the aftermath of the book. What if we pick up the book in 5 years or 10? What do you hope from that? Do you hope it as a source book for students or for international curators that want to do something about Italy, or to expand?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of project, first of all, I think it could be a good tool, like, to looking back, as we did already with some similar volumes that were published before, like Express and Exit. And so it would be even like, in 10 years, but already 5, because things are already like now changing so much that it also, like, reading history in terms of decades is totally like outdated model. So yeah, I think most of all, I think would be a good resource also because I mean, we talked about that, but like trying to find also what was done before in terms of similar research, and you don't have so much also in terms of maybe kind of books, more theoretical books on the last 15 years in terms of artist production in Italy. You have just a book that Luca wrote recently, but it's more like a pamphlet or Bartolomeo Petromarchi, or you have all these books written by Francesco Borani, but of course they're like more kind of for a large audience. So I think we need these kind of books. I think we need more, and also different. This would be. I mean, I would like you also to see the same commission. How could be developed in a different way? We just propose a way of doing it. Maybe instead a real storia dell'arte as Argan done would be interesting. Like taking the responsibility of writing a very vertical instead kind of analysis of what happened. We are very horizontal in a way, as you can guess from the
we are clear in mind the fact that it will not be the next Cream, the next final book. It's not the best. It's not the next thing. It's not the best artist necessarily, even if we believe in this artist. And there isn't any curatorial statement apart from the fact that we decided to do this book, which is the main curatorial statement with this shape, this precise shape. And the wish is that it might be a source, since it works as a source for, not necessarily for art historians or for curators, but hopefully for non-necessarily academic historians. Even if John is an academic historian, is the reason why he's here is actually we're wishing that someone as him will be using this book in the future in order to read some histories that are not necessarily written in the usual art reviews of magazines, and not necessarily also in the everyday magazines, the newspapers, as the history of something that was very important in the early 2000s when some institutions were kind of looking the next thing, the next important thing, say the macro, say the Fondazione Olivetti in Roma, say the Castello di Livori, say the Fondazione Patrizio Senatore Baudin in Torino, say the Galleria Comunale in Monfalcone, say the Mambo, plenty of them, for sure, say the Madre, the Pani in Napoli, and they're all not there anymore. So it's great, we are living in a great country, and we used to live in a great country, with an amazing selection, but something happened, and that is not so nice. And we are hoping that something will be changing, but what we're experiencing right now, it's not so shining as it seems. So we should be also honest about that, since there is a reason why I'm not there. And the reason is probably that there isn't space, and there wasn't space for more than 30 years for people working dealing with art, with contemporary art. So I'm sad to say that, but it's one of the tasks of this book, is kind of witness something that was there, that was very important. I mean, we know there are so many very interesting exhibitions happening everywhere, and see Aurico is a beautiful exhibition, beautiful. An important exhibition recently in Oslo about the state of Europe. Strangely enough, Italy is not there. And the whole exhibition was about, I mean, not the whole, but one of the main concepts of the exhibition was about independent spaces, artisan spaces. So why nothing from Italy is there? So that's one of the tasks of this book, was to hopefully become a way to plane, to fly, and to stay in the air as much as possible as a satellite. That's what we hope, and to be somehow visible, even if we're dealing with something that is not necessarily strong in terms of what press considers strong today. So the blue chips in the market and so on. So we're not speaking about market. There isn't any heavy gallery involved. Yes, there are a few galleries in the selection in the first part, and they are not the usual galleries. It's just Monitor, for instance, or Francesco Pantaleone, or some small galleries that really supported Zero or helped a younger generation to become a little more relevant on the international scene. I think that's a part of the answer.
May I ask a question in Italian?
Sure.
Okay, I apologize.
Vi ringrazio innanzitutto per lo sforzo di comprensione, per questa curiosità critica e per questo coraggio, insomma, che avete dimostrato nel pubblicare questo volume, che è uno strumento di lavoro, fondamentalmente, secondo me. Voglio proporvi però una riflessione che può suonare un po' provocatoria, ma che è spinta dallo stesso amore che voi avete per l'arte. Il titolo insolito del vostro libro, no? Terrazza, mi ha richiamato la mente anche alla terrazza, a quella terrazza della grande bellezza, su cui un critico e disincantato Tony Servillo, alias Jepp Gambardella, esclamava: le vedi queste persone, questa fauna? Questa è la mia vita e non è niente. Ora, il carattere frammentario, transitorio, spesso effimero dell'arte di oggi, dominata dal mercato, l'ha fatta talvolta somigliare a un party radical chic, di cui è difficile definire coordinate, orientamenti e fondamenta destinate a durare nel tempo. Quali elementi abbiamo? Quali elementi avete voi rilevato? Come possiamo essere sicuri oggi che tra una generazione, aprendo la terrazza da voi curato, non saremo lì ad esclamare: li vedi questi artisti, queste opere? Questa è stata la nostra arte negli anni zero e non è niente.
Maybe we can answer in English.
Yeah. So I don't know if the audience got it.
It's very hard to translate the question.
Maybe John could.
I don't think I can translate the question because it was so beautifully, written. But the question is about: will this, or some, if I'm not misinterpreting you, will something remain of this, of what you've written, or will it end up in nothing, as some of the 90s did? If I'm not misinterpreting you, but your question was much better than that. But I think it was a question about what will remain and whether it means anything.
The duration, the time, yeah.
I mean, of course, it's a big question and very hard to respond because, as maybe Andrea already said, in a way, these books already, the contents of the books is already about things that disappear, and so I don't know. I'm not good to reply to such open question because I don't know. It's sometimes asking like two generic questions are very different to grasp. That's why I don't know if the question of what is art or what is good or what is bad. I don't know if I can. It's really like something interesting for me. So maybe I'm sure something will stay, but also if something will disappear, will stay anyhow as a kind of leftover in the back of our mind, and I think that would be important anyhow. And I don't know if you had like a more kind of specific, or you're thinking about that, apart from the comparison to La Grande Bellezza and to what he say about what he was watching in that terrazza.
Yeah, I do agree completely with Luca. Without pretending to be Jack and Badella, we try to probably collect what, in any case, will not belong to the future. So that was the task, trying to remember something that will be forgotten anyway. So it depends on the book. We don't know if the book will be surviving, how long will the book be surviving. We know if the book will be surviving. If it's too related to contemporary, it will be surviving probably 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So the main, one of the main issues for us was really trying to map something which is sometimes related to, it might be too sentimental, but it's maybe too atmospheric, but needs to be remembered. So that was the main task. And yes, so it's also on ephemera. But we are in an ephemera era, and we need to find a way to fight with this or to deal with this. And that's a book, it's not a website. It's a book that pretends to be an exhibition, or might be an exhibition. So as an exhibition, be disappearing or staying in the memory of the people that visited it, as they say. So that was the intention. About the artists, we don't know, obviously. It's always like that. I mean, how many artists will be surviving after the next biennial? We don't know that. But we really will need to do that work because there is still to, I mean, it's a very interesting thing. It's something very interesting what's happening in Italy. And it's not only about a few artists, as it was in the past, a generation, a group, a movement. It's sometimes about a scene, some friends, people that will be together, working together, sometimes collaborating, or it's about constellation of people that will be hanging around some places, and those people are often artists and often really trying to understand what will be the future of their work, of themselves, or it's, yeah, as always. But we would like some of those artists to be shown, not only in independent or artisan space in Italy. We really would like to, we hope it will be shown everywhere, possibly in the Venice Biennial, which is not the case often. I mean, it wasn't the case in the recent past. Yeah, so we try to provide also a tool, somehow, a device.
Yeah, of course, if everything will vanish, you will, like, this book will be like a bit listening to an old record and with this kind of nostalgic kind of attitude. But yeah, let's be positive.
But it's
Hope
still
not.
yellow. It's still yellow, so it's shining color.
Yes.
I don't know how much time we have.
Yes, we have time. I believe we can.
I think they are. Yeah, so.
Potete dire perché ho visto 3 nomi, cioè i fratelli De Serio e Michelangelo Framartino, cioè they are set in English. The names of 3 directors, film directors. Why particularly those? I mean, Michelangelo Framartino is particularly poetic and artistic, etc. And the 7 Acts of Mercy by the fratelli De Serio, why? Why those names?
Yeah, on the one hand, we were kind of trying to map not necessarily the stereotype of creativity, which is a dangerous word and was a dangerous word in the recent past of Italy, but really try to respect unusual parts. So actually, the Serio brothers are no, I mean, they had some moments of exposure in the art world, but not so much. But their work is so interesting, so meaningful, and there are so many very interesting exhibitions about the idea of documenting and mapping and reframing realities. And their work on immigration in Torino, or this kind of work. It's amazing. And it's so sad that it will not be considered by any art curator. So we thought that we would need to put them in the book. Same as for Michelangelo Framartino, somehow. While Michelangelo background, we try also to respect, we weren't kind of clearly art historian, but in the end we are art historian. And Michelangelo background is somehow art. I mean, he did start as someone who tried to explore the medium video in the late 90s. He did work with Studio Zolo, and he presented his work sometimes in an art context. If you might know, during the last important festival in New York, downtown New York, important independent film festival there, I don't remember the name, sorry. Tribeca, thank you. That's a lot about the need to do. His work was shown at the PS1 as an installation. So, I mean, we know his work will be considered by the Centre d'Art de Genève in the future. So, yes, I mean, it's not surprising. Why should we have Artisti cool having a great exhibition and not Michelangelo Framartino? So what's the main principles, the bet, trying to find a way to consider people that otherwise would not be considered.
Okay. So even the seventh art is in your book.
Yes, it's not a consideration about the artwork, it's a consideration about the identity of an author. There might be some, for instance, Francesco Pedralli is actually a writer in the end. He's a great writer, a very interesting writer, but he did find his space in the art context, because we all know that the art context, so it's the main thing of the art world, it's so open, and the borders are open, and you will always kind of, not necessarily fishing on the market point of view an artist, but you could always consider a relevant figure as someone that is showing his work in the art context. So Francesco will be having hopefully a career in the art because of his practice, which is an unusual practice as a writer. So we consider him as an artist.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? So,
I consider there are at least two artists that work in this book.
Salvatore Rauch e Patrizio Massimo, se non mi sbaglio. I don't know if you want just to say, comment, or just any thoughts about not only the book or.
Well, obviously I was very pleased to be asked to be part of the book. Sorry.
Salvatore Rauch.
Yeah, sorry. I'm supposed to say that. I haven't really prepared anything, but I think the discussion was very interesting, and some kind of interesting points. I really enjoyed the question about the grande bellezza. I thought it was quite naughty, but at the same time relevant. I think if I was to kind of answer to that, I would say probably something that Luca, the speakers tonight have discussed. I would say probably there is a lack of structure in the support structure in the Italian scene, and that's probably something that in the long term might make a difference to certain people lasting longer, certain artists making a longer career out of it. And I would say perhaps things are changing thanks to people like you guys that are spreading the words about the work that we are doing in Italy or over here.